Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a Tuesday morning. We're going to jump right into the social seven. So the social seven is the countertype seven in the sense that it is difficult to recognize the passion for gluttony in them, as they strive to hide it with altruistic behavior that somehow should purify them from the guilt of feeling an attraction towards pleasure or personal advantage. Okay, so that's a mouthful of a first sentence, but it contains a lot of information. So we're in the seven, we're in the thinking triad, in the head triad, in the fear triad. And unlike the six, which is the core number of the thinking triad, who lives more directly in their fear, the seven has a survival strategy for coping with fear that amounts to essentially avoidance and distraction and seeking the positive. So that's the passion of gluttony. And that's fundamentally a self-preservation passion, right? It's a self-interested passion. I need to avoid pain, guilt, fear, threat by seeking out pleasure and jumping from pleasure to pleasure, and to some extent bringing pleasure to others, as we talked about in the introduction. So the social seven then, this subtype, is the countertype seven, because this is the subtype that least looks like the passion. It's sort of it's like a countermeasure to the passion. So while we'll talk about the sexual and the social the sexual and the self-preservation seven as more reflective of gluttony, the social seven feels guilty about feeling this attraction toward pleasure and avoidance of pain. They're aware of and feel guilt or feel conflict around this self-interest. And so their passion is sacrifice. Well, let's keep going. This is an attraction they try not to feel by pursuing an ideal of themselves and an ideal of the world. They sacrifice their gluttony to be better and for a better world where there is no pain or conflict. Social sevens are people who on the surface do not want to exploit others, do not want to be tied to their desires. They're very pure people, too pure. Some sevens are very concerned about their diet, world hunger, etc. The New Age fashion was a hotbed of this social seven culture. It would seem that the individual has the intuition of hiding a pig inside themselves and says, no, I will define myself by being a detached pig. That's how the social seven is. The word ichaso used was sacrifice, but it is a sacrifice of gluttony. It is a postponement of desires before an ideal. So it's the deception. The deception consists in that these people really have a great gluttony for recognition of their sacrifice. They crave others to see them as very good. Now I'm going to give a bad example, this is still Naranjo, of the social seven, as I will refer to the life of a true saint, much venerated in the Christian world. Obviously I'm talking about Saint Francis, who is this type of person. And yet Francis is one of the most frequently named sevens. St. Francis followed the kind of advice that William Blake gave. If we lived madness and followed it, then it would turn into wisdom. If the crazy and neurotic man lives his madness completely, he would become wise. It is a path. So St. Francis wanted to be good. Therefore, he did all the things that a seven needs to do for transformation. He lived miserably, lifted stones to repair the sanctuary, kissed the lepers. Nothing could be more horrible. So he did all the right things to detach from his seven. But if we examine St. Francis's early life, we will find a very revealing anecdote. Along with his monks, the saint built a sort of tent for shelter. Suddenly it started to rain, and St. Francis and his monks headed to the shelter to rest. But upon arrival, they found a farmer with his cow inside the tent. And Franciscan generosity had to give priority to the farmer and his cow. It seems to me that health, both mental and spiritual, has to do with loving what your neighbor asks of you. But when you love your neighbor more than yourself, then you are trying to be too good. This is very typical of nuns, And some social sevens can also get into that kind of goodness stereotype, which consists of trying to be good according to a code or social consensus. Maybe today's humans would be tempted to think that they have more rights than a cow, but maybe we are wrong about this too. Deep ecology has something to tell us about it. But where is the limit of goodness? There's a kind of goodness for applause, very typical of the social seven. So that's the introduction to the social seven. And so it's performative sacrifice. It's not, its falsehood seems to lie in two places. One is it still feels like a means toward an end to be toward safety, right? If I sacrifice, then I will be celebrated and appreciated as good, and then I'll be safe and safe from pain. And so remember the social six. And so you always want to remember when you're working with wings, if you're resonating with the social seven, then you want to look at the social eight and the social six. And so the social six was duty, right? Wanting to find a role in the good organization so that you know that you're good and you can fight against the baddies, right? So the social six, we used the passion, duty. The image that I used were the famous terracotta statue warriors, right? So duty, having a role is really important for the social six. In the social seven, there's a lot of similarity, but the social seven wants to stand out for his or her sacrifice, for his goodness. But his goodness is still taken from, basically wholesale, from some social construct. So the seven isn't necessarily thinking or contemplating much on what goodness is. The seven is sort of like subscribing to the culture's norms around goodness. And that's one of the tells of the social seven, is like they're not necessarily going to be preoccupied with goodness the way that maybe a one would be. You know, the one really is seeking perfection and morality and goodness. The seven, the social seven, you might see some of that sort of goodness for the sake of applause or for the sake of social safety. Now, with this case of St. Francis and the cows, I don't know. I think the author here, Peñarrubia, doesn't necessarily know either. He asks, what is the limit of goodness, right? I find it hard to believe that Francis was thinking that someone would applaud him on the outside, but maybe there's a little bit of skepticism that why did he, it's such it's such a grand gesture to give up your monastery's shelter for one farmer and one cow. And at that point, you might squint at it and be like, to what end did that make sense? And even if there were no external applause there, St. Francis may feel the applause of God, right? The applause of some inner father figure that is saying, you're just the best. Wow, you really sacrificed your whole monastery. What a hero. And that really can motivate the social seven. So let's read about the transformation of the social seven by Francisco Peñarrubia. And this is a longer one, so I'm going to skim. The word sacrifice, with which Claudio Naranjo has traditionally labeled the social subtype of Enneatype 7, aptly portrays a complacent and generous personality, capable of managing projects and mobilizing energies for a determined goal, to which they can devote themselves with great dedication. This requires enthusiasm, idealism, and social skills, and a sacrifice 7 usually has all those in abundance. Such a stance toward the world has many egoic compensations: appreciation, recognition, good image, conflict reduction, and creating debts in the other so that they treat you well as in return. Ultimately generating interested relationships that end up devoid of real meaning, I-thou, or he says I-you, with a tendency towards superficiality. Well, a killer first paragraph. And, that really, I think, rounds it up. It captures so much, including part of the reason why sevens don't go to Enneagram workshops is you can see that their survival strategy is one of the most pro-social, one of the most sort of successful in society, right? I mean, this is a person who's going to make friends, who's going to succeed, who's going to do great work in the world, who's going to feel a sense of purpose and calling. So there's not necessarily a problem here unless, right? And again, I'm only looking at the Enneagram through this lens of addiction. What is the passion of your identity? What is the mechanism? What is the pattern that's operating that's preventing you from touching real life, real contact, real meaning? And that's the question that the seven needs to just ask themselves is like, is there emptiness here? Is there, I don't mean Buddhist emptiness with all of its connotations. I just mean like, is there a hole here? Is there a vacuum here? And are all my relationships, all my success, are they really nourishing me fully? Or is there a way that all of that feels a little bit performative? Is it, as Peñarrubia says here, am I generating interested relationships that end up devoid of real meaning, you, with a tendency towards superficiality? Who do I go to when I'm really hurting? And so that's why a seven might undertake this work. We're so far removed from the 4, the 5, and to some extent the 6, our first 3, who, in all likelihood are finding this work because their survival strategies are pretty maladaptive. The 7, let's learn more about why people come to the work through the writing. The path towards self-realization involves dissolving this compulsion to be a good child, facing two complex and complicated internal obstacles, guilt and selfishness. The guilt is hidden, rather projected, blaming others for their lack of commitment and dedication. The latent complaint is, with all that I have done and how unfairly I am treated, or reproaching oneself for being naive and delusional, for expecting so much from humankind. So this is interesting. So the 7's path, there you might start by noticing how there's this, you're being disappointed by those around you. Why is nobody trying as hard as I am? Why doesn't anyone care that I've done? I'm working so much. Why isn't anybody else? And if that pattern starts to appear in multiple areas, it starts to point toward the inner obstacles that are being written about here. Behind all this, there's guilt for feeling so interested under the mask of being good, for manipulating through enthusiasm, for delegating excessively in the name of tolerance, etc. So they begin to distrust their good intentions, feel quite miserable, and get confused between what is altruism and or selfishness. And that's really hard work to do, right? If so much of your identity is wrapped up in being a good person, in being altruistic, and you have to start to examine that for truth and find that there's falsehood underneath it, that's a very difficult path. I think the 7 and the 2, and they're sort of at the same latitude on the Enneagram, and Naranjo has a lot to say about that. We're not going to get into now. The 7 and the 2 have a lot in common in this way, that they both have some of the most pro-social behaviors. In the 7, it's essentially positivity, and in the 2, it's essentially love. But they're both plagued with falsehood. In the case of the 2, Naranjo talks about false love. In the case of the 7, Naranjo talks about fraudulence. And here I feel like I should dampen this a little bit, which is to say that both the 7 and the 2 have real true gifts of positivity, real true gifts of love. They really are that. And they have to start looking, if they want to do this kind of work, they have to start looking at how frequently that approach is driven by self-interest and self-protection. So I love the example of like delegating, right? Let's get everybody involved, which sort of is hiding potentially deep laziness, or potentially hiding accountability, right? If it's all on me, then I could get fired, I could get scolded, I could be wrong, I could be in the doghouse. These are things that the 7 cannot have. But if I delegate, less work for me, just spread the blame around. And by the way, when we win, I'm going to be shout out to this person. 7s are so good at that, like especially a social 7, right? Hey, I just want to thank, get so and so up here, like. That like spreading the credit, but really now you're just getting more credit for being a credit spreader. The 7s are like incredible at this stuff, but they're not actually likely to be aware of it. They don't know what they're doing until they start to do this work. I love 7s, just for the record. So, I have like 7s circling me as I do this work, and I just want to give them a hug. Like, I love you. They really are quite positive people, but fear is really there. The 6, the fear is even more present, and the 7 has just pushed their fear really far down. And there's just this energy, this nimble intellectualism that Naranjo was talking about before. Okay, let's continue. Changing from being for the other to being for oneself is a complicated process. Attending to one's deepest motivations is extremely difficult because either you don't see them or they seem quote unquote bad. So they must be disguised as altruism, idealism, dedication, and sacrifice to make them acceptable. The reverse path is to recognize comfort, laziness, narcissism, and then the insatiable hunger for recognition and love. The healthy path for a social 7 is to decriminalize selfishness. I love that. To turn this taboo around and start truly loving oneself, legitimizing one's real needs instead of disguising them fraudulently. There are many contributions in this regard received from other 7s. And we'll talk about those in a second. This is such a great few lines, and it applies to every type. I want to explore it for a second more deeply. So, the path for a 7 is to decriminalize selfishness and to make it not a taboo anymore. However, it's weird because they've been selfish this whole time. And in fact, their most, their closest relationships, their spouses, their parents or children, they already know, right? So if you're married to a social 7, you see through. This is not like rocket science. Like, other people can see through this for you. So they've already been experiencing you as selfish, but as fraudulently altruistic, right? So you've been selfish. And so probably your partner wants you to stop being selfish. But you're in a really different place. You need to actually decriminalize selfishness and start to be nakedly selfish for a phase. That's kind of the first path. And it's almost like that's true for every type. So let's see if we can come up with, an example from what we've done in the past. The 4, we're talking about I'll just go to myself, like the self-preservation 4, whose passion is tenacity, this kind of clenched intensity that's coming from like a devouring need to perform, keep things together, but there's always this sense of not enoughness, right? So envy is the passion of the 4, and the way that envy shows up for the self-preservation 4 is sort of this not envious of others, not externally oriented, but internally devouring oneself. So what was talked about for the self-preservation 4 is the self-preservation 4 actually needs to decriminalize intensity. But the self-preservation 4's partners or spouses, spouse, partner, whoever, they already can see that intensity. Anyone who's close to the self-preservation 4 knows and feels that intensity. So the last thing they want is for that self-preservation 4 to become more intense. And yet the healthy path for self-preservation 4 is to decriminalize intensity or decriminalize anger. It's the same. It's really, I think decriminalizing the thing that you've been suppressing, I guess. What's the right word for it? It's just you've been lying to yourself about being is so important there. And that's like the kind of, I don't know what you would call it. It's like the ugly duckling phase of the inner work, where you have to start owning the very thing that you feel most afraid to own. And the reason that's so difficult is because it's going to drive the people around you crazy. So, continuing with the 7, this is great. That Francisco Peñarrubia. This is the first author of any of these subtype chapters who starts pulling in quotes from other social 7s. So I'll read a few, but just also notice how in the character of the type that is. Right. And it's wonderful, right? Like, again, we're not trying to criticize the behaviors of these types. We're trying to illuminate the addictions that are latent in each type. So just because someone behaves in a socially altruistic way doesn't mean it's bad or should be changed or anything like that. You're just trying to help the person gain instinct for saying, well, why did I do that? What was behind that? So anyway, so here's Peñarrubia pulling in, like a great social 7, other voices. Being more for myself and less for the other. Being more deeply selfish, knowing what I want and need. That's Irene Diaz. Legitimizing one's own and others' no without conditioning or commodifying it. Generally, we use sacrifice to cover our deficits and lacks, to claim recognition and admiration, to be loved. Enrique de Diego. Sacrifice and service is the price to pay for my neurotic needs for others' admiration. Josep Miko. Acceptance that nothing happens, but not in a superficial sense of false joy, or rather of superficial joy, but in the line of trust in others, and above all, real trust in myself. Jaime Locotura. And so on. So, continuing, the most notable thing that has been falling away is idealism. The mix of illusion, good intentions, idealization, and naivety that functions as an intellectual drug, a cognitive stimulant for action. With a shot of idealism, and idealism I think is a great word here, because it also includes sort of, idealism doesn't feel that intellectually rigorous. And 7s, despite their intellectual capabilities and their speed, aren't deep. They're not going to be, depth is not their go-to move. With a shot of idealism, one can maintain the energy and effort that every sacrifice entails. Otherwise, the strength and dedication would wane and time would be spent dreaming and not doing. So the 7 really needs idealism. The 7 really needs optimism, positivity, belief in a better world in order to motivate their actions. The 7 didn't feel like there would be success. And this feels a little 3-ish. Like, I think the 7s are probably pretty good at like getting out of a sinking ship. That's kind of a fun question of like, if a social 7's on a Titanic, what do they do? The social 7 is active, driven by ideals that they try to materialize in life, generally referring to improving the world, whether from religious, sociopolitical, therapeutic premises, with a certain sense of mission, not in the most extreme version of messianism, but in that of the visionary, one who is capable of imagining a freer or more peaceful or healthier world, or whatever moves them. In this idealism, there's a considerable component of rationalization and ideology, almost always in favor of changing the obsolete for the modern. If any of these beliefs prove to be wrong, they're changed for another, explaining this change as evolution. That's a great last line right there, and speaks to a bit of the fraudulence. That's the ego fixation that Naranjo uses. Although you'll see others, we talked about idealism could be a great fixation word, or self-indulgence has come up as a fixation. But right, that you're not gonna find a way to tell a seven, for a seven to be like, I was wrong, right? The seven's gonna be like, I learned, right? That old idea, that, wow, what a great thing we've learned. Now we've got this new idea, forward progress, but not forward progress in, okay, so how do you separate the 3 and the 7 in this way? The 3 is, especially the social 7, I think that's important. That's like a big question. So, the surface level, they might seem pretty similar, right? They both might be really active leaders in an organization. They might be ralliers of people. They might be really committed to forward progress. The 3 might be a little bit more driven. The 7 might be a little bit more sort of people oriented, especially the social 7, right? Rallying people. If you've ever used colors, right? The social 7 might be a little bit more yellow, right? Like inclusive. The 3 might be a little bit more results driven, goal oriented. And here's where it gets weird. Despite that difference that I just showed of the social 7 maybe being a little bit more people oriented and the 3 being a little bit more goal oriented, ultimately the 3 actually is in it for love. The 3, all of the 3's effort, all of the 3's productivity, all of the 3's need for achievement and forward progress is ultimately around how they are seen. They want to be seen in such a way that they're loved. They are still caught up in some kind of wound around conditional love and have lost their connection with being loved unconditionally for who they are, not for what they do. And so all of that doing is in pursuit of being worthy of love. That's why they're in the heart triad. Even though their feelings repressed, it's still really about feelings for the 3. And the 3 has this image of themselves that they've made a horrible kind of deal early in life to prioritize this image of themselves and not their real selves. And so all of those accolades accrue to the image. And then they're like left empty, still not getting the love that they really want. The social 7, okay, goal-oriented, sure, inclusive, visionary, enthusiastic, visionary. Come on, let's go. We can do it. We can climb over that hill. Let's make the world a better place. They're not. That's just like energy. As I said here, with a shot of idealism, one can maintain the energy. As long as I'm positive, and as long as I'm surrounded by positivity, and as long as we have a positive goal in mind, I have so much energy, and we can do it. There's a ton of speed, agility, nimbleness, stamina, fast metabolism. The 7 is like a metabolizer, right? We talked about gluttony as this tasting but not digesting. They're tasting everything. But you can see how close that is to fleeing, right? It's just, instead of being tied to what am I fleeing from, they're fleeing toward. That's the move from the 6 to the 7. The 6 is more connected with what they're fleeing from. The 7 is more connected with what they're fleeing toward. But they're still fleeing. This is still a fear type. So what are they afraid of? well, they're afraid of, on the one hand, experiencing pain, and because they've never developed the capacity for being with pain, they have this huge sort of pain backlog of, I'm afraid to experience failure, death, conflict, whatever. But underneath even, I think, that fear of pain is, I get the sense of a 7 being terrified of annihilation, of being swallowed up or trapped or imprisoned by this monstrous depression that they either experienced in their own family, or it's just their own, I guess you could call that a shadow. It's like the monster in the closet who, just imagine someone who's sad and nobody ever put their arm around them and be like, yeah, man, you're having a tough day, huh? If you ignore that feeling for 30 years, there's going to be someone who's super depressed in there somewhere. And the seven has that, I think, somewhere. The 7 has a lot of negative feelings that have been left unfelt. And the more they unfeel them, the more kind of intense the threat of feeling them is. There's this, real fear for the 7 that, gosh, if I slowed down and felt all these things, I don't think I would get swallowed up. And that's terrifying. So the 7 is a fleeing type. The 7 is a fear type. All of 7's goal orientation is actually at least as much about the fear of, what am I running from, as what I'm running toward. The 3 really is running toward a goal of, I'll get loved when / if I X. Okay. Let's start speeding up. I know we're already 30 minutes into this. The dissolution of this idealistic structure is therefore very difficult and at the same time inevitable if one takes maturation seriously. The fear of ceasing to be driven by ideals is that of falling into apathy, losing the fuel that allows them to intervene in the world, exist socially, and be recognized. At the core, there is a deep pessimism toward oneself, towards people, and towards the world. With a little more confidence in life, there would be no need for so much indoctrination in one's ideals, nor so much effort to please and mobilize others with these ideals. Something of all this is being abandoned in exchange for greater and more authentic trust. Yeah, right. So a 7, it's almost like if you're talking about, if you're, let's say you're an 8, a 9, a 1, a 2, really any type, but someone who's involved in impact work, right? Mission-driven work. The 7 might sort of be, we've got to do this so that X, and they might have this genuine optimism that a lot of people in impact might not share. I mean, there are a lot of people doing incredible work that are pessimistic, are very concerned, are like, the shit's on fire, and I don't even know if I'm making a difference. Right? Like, I'm doing this work. This is my life's work. I don't know if I'm making a difference. I don't know if what's going to happen. I'm scared. But they do the work anyway. And I think that's very bewildering for a 7, because that forces a 7 to confront some of this pessimism, deep pessimism that's being described here. Whereas other types integrate that pessimism and work with that pessimism and work despite that pessimism. Pema Chodron talks about hopelessness, right? I think that would be terrifying for a 7, hopelessness. But her point is, if you can contact hopelessness, there's no hope, and move fully through that, there's so much liberation on the other side. Going back to the Titanic, right? Like, okay, we're going to sink. Now how do I want to show up? And I'm not saying that's a better way to live. I'm just saying that that's really threatening for a 7 to even entertain. The mind of a social 7 has something of a permanent adolescent, provocative, enlightened, simplistic, and lazy when the task becomes too demanding. Growing up literally means becoming an adult, being realistic, less subjective and willful, more understanding of the models previously ideologically denounced. More quotes. Here Peñarrubia shares kind of his own manifesto, and it's interesting, and he himself sort of says that he appreciates that it's extreme, but he needed to go extreme in this direction to address how extreme he'd been in the previous direction. So he says, what a social 7 would have to understand to transform, that the world is beyond repair, that humanity is quite abominable, that beliefs are self-hypnotic, that there are a few solid and respectable values, the search for truth and knowledge, correct action, compassion. Everything else is questionable or directly false. And with all of this, not falling into cynicism, accepting the pain of lucidity, and honoring life as a sacred joke, which is not the same as surviving or adapting. He shares, he says, I've ended up with a manifesto, a somewhat skeptical, anti-idealist declaration of renunciation of altruistic ideas to cure this subtype's illusoriness. Therefore, let's see other contributions less iconoclastic than mine, and he brings in others. Let's quickly browse those. Miko says, I had a vision of Jesus Christ with these words, you have already sacrificed enough, now it's time to live. It goes back to that messianic piece. And the social 7 is not messianic, but there may be value in the 7 handing over some of this sacrificing responsibility, this duty, pulling in the word of the 6, to a higher power. Right? I'm not Jesus, and part of the sacrifice of Jesus, or of whatever power I want to bring in, is so that I can live my life as a human being. Duran says that the world can function without your presence, that what the body feels is real and appropriate, that what needs to be done is what life puts in front of you, and it must be done at the moment. Doing requires time, awareness, presence. The hardest thing, Peñarrubia says, is to recognize one's own and others' limitations in love. Not everything is pure and perfect, nor does the opposite justify disbelief. What is hard is to humanize, to see the other as such, and not as an expression of your unattainable models. In my work, a certain emotional indifference has been appearing, initially forbidden and reprehensible, but later recognized. In reality, it is not feeling less, but feeling better, quality instead of quantity. Fewer things move you, but those that are genuine touch your heart more deeply. I love that. Actually, cultivating indifference can be maybe a powerful asset for the 7. Let's talk about the 3 loves here a little bit, because that's such a theme in Naranjo, and I don't know enough about it. But in this same line of the 3 loves, father, mother, child, which is interesting, father, mother, child, because sometimes I thought the 3rd love was sexual union, but here we have child present as a 3rd love. We present some more contributions, followed by more generic reflections on love and affections. In my feelings of the 3 loves, I see fraudulence. In the father's love, admiration, there is competition. It is an example to follow and soon surpass, with the illusory dream of becoming another who surpasses the old limits. The mother's love, compassion, seems like an overwhelming current of empathy, but it is a deception. I pass over my loneliness, hiding it in the illusion of being together in this, seeking companionship and comfort in this valley of tears, but without revealing my feelings, without letting myself be touched. Childish love, pleasure. Okay, so that's where you get sexual union too. It's this, going back to the sexual type, right? That's the child love is it's kind of like I'm looking for the word. Maybe pleasure is just the best we can do. Bliss. Maybe bliss is another word for it. It's like sexual pleasure would be an instance of this more profound kind of love that's being described here. That's union love, maybe union love, merging love, bliss energy. Childish love sometimes gets confused with indiscipline or distraction. I realize feelings of guilt or interjects that contaminate my naturalness and control fluidity, abandonment, and trust in life. Fear paralyzes the child's creativity. So what Munth is saying here is just noticing fraudulence across these three loves of admiration, compassion, and bliss energy. Not getting to truly experience any of those loves because they're sort of skipping over. And I can really connect to this. Anyone who's, I think, very fast can connect to like, oh yeah, I get it, so let's move on. And there might be different motivations behind that, but oh yeah, I'm having a fantasy of compassion, so no need for me to be touched. Oh yeah, I'm having a fantasy of being admired, so no need for me to think about the work that needs to be done here. Oh yeah, I'm having the fantasy of bliss, pleasure, so I'm not actually going to allow myself to surrender to it and be lost in it. The hardest thing is to keep the heart open. My biggest difficulty is to surrender. So this whole book doesn't talk about virtues much at all, but here Naranjo touches on it, or Peñarrubia does. In the general wave of practicing the virtue of sobriety, it is good for the social seven to stop, slow down their actions, curb anxious action, and prioritize what has intrinsic importance. The development of non-action as a psychospiritual attitude is the most powerful field of experimentation for their transformation. We were talking about indifference just a minute ago. What does like not doing anything, not responding do? It does not correspond to the passivity or comfort that every seven drags, but to a detachment from interested, egoic, narcissistic action and an approach to action per se, to well-done work, not in the sense of perfectionism, but of impeccability, doing what is needed at each moment without going overboard or falling short. Then much of the compulsive activity ceases to make sense. Things simplify, and the inner chemistry transforms doing into being, helping the experience of being. And that's really powerful advice for a few different types, but certainly the two and the seven, I think, share that transformation edge of conscious non-doing, conscious non-action, conscious non-responsiveness. What happens when I don't respond to the needs of others or the perceived needs of others, and do less and become more elective, more choosy in terms of what I pick up. Meditation, listening to one's own body, etc. Okay. So that's the social seven, and we'll pick up with the sexual seven next time.